When you think of a musical, what comes to your head? A show that features music to progress the story, or a show that is sung through? Let me ask you a more specific question. When you see a musical, what do you expect it to have? A classical orchestra that plays the long overtures with long songs, or something else? Something else was on the mind of a young man named Jonathan Larson. You may not recognize his name or maybe his face, but his work you won't forget. Jonathan David Larson was born on February 4, 1960 in Mount Vernon, New York. As a kid, his parents, Nanette and Alan Larson, would take him and his sister Julie to the big city to see the musicals in the New York Lights at the time. This was Jonathan's first exposure to Broadway theater, and more importantly, it was his first exposure to the works of a man that would go on to be his biggest influence and mentor. That man was the late Stephen Sondheim. At the same time, a lot of the music he listened to were not only musicals written at the time, but also popular rock musicians and bands such as Elton John, The Doors, The Who, Billy Joel, etc. But throughout time, his musical taste expanded. Not only was he interested in listening to music, but he also began performing at a young age, with him playing the piano, tuba, and trumpet, with him later joining as a vocalist for his school choir. It was also at this time when he met his best friend, Matt O'Grady, in the 3rd grade. Jonathan attended White Plains High School in White Plains, New York from 1974 to 1978. During his time there, he further developed his love for theater by acting and performing in the school's respective productions. After graduating high school, Larson went to Adelphi University in Garden City, New York, where he majored in acting and had a 4-year scholarship. This is where he began to discover music composition and theater, and during his time he composed music for small student productions and a musical known as The Book of Good Love. It was at this university where he met his friend Victoria Leacock Hoffman during a production of Godspell in the early 80s. Victoria was not just his friend, but also his biggest supporter when it came to his dream of writing musical theater for Broadway, and she would go on to help him produce shows in the hopes of one of them receiving a Broadway transfer. Jonathan graduated from Adelphi in 1982 with a Bachelor of Fine Arts. He decided not to pursue acting after all and pursue being a composer for musical theater instead. Now, despite having his mind set on what he wanted to do, it didn't mean that the world was ready to agree with him. New York City in the 80s was a very different place as crime rates were high and the economy was uncertain. But this time also served as an inspiration for Jonathan. He oversaw a rise of commercialization where wealth, status, and excess became visible in media and entertainment. Corporations expanded television advertising with the birth of channels such as MTV, Home Shopping Network, and QVC, reshaping the culture of consumerism and presentation. It wasn't just this that he saw around him, he was born into the generation of the yuppies. A yuppie is defined as a college-educated adult who works in a big city at high-paying jobs. If this change in America didn't upset Larson enough, there was something that was going to upset him more, and that was commercialization spreading to Broadway like if it were a virus, as big commercial success musicals such as Cats, Les Mis, etc. were on the rise. Now Jonathan was questioning where the Broadway he knew as a child went, and this was the beginning for work on his first major musical project. He developed a plan in 1982 where he would write a musical based on George Orwell's famous novel 1984, with the goal of him having his musical adaptation on stage in 1984. He recorded demos in 1983 and reached out to the Orwell estate for permission to go through with the musical. The Orwell estate did have interest, but due to the upcoming film adaptation of the novel at the time that was set to be released at the same goal point of Larson's adaptation, they passed on his request. Despite them passing on 1984 being a musical on Broadway, 1984 did eventually make it to Broadway in 2017 as a play, and the play ran for a short time and was graphic and controversial. Jonathan was unhappy with the news, but decided to write his own version of the story that 1984 was. This developed into the first major original work of his, Superbia. Superbia was a science fiction musical set in the year 2064 that combined musical elements of new wave synth pop and rock along with the traditional Broadway and vaudeville styles. When first writing the musical, he described it as a futuristic fairy tale along the lines of the Cinderella and the Emperor's New Clothes. By 1985, Larson was fully committed to the project of Superbia. He wanted his demos of the musical to reflect what he wanted the final product to sound like, and to ensure this, he used a 50-key Casio keyboard until 1987, where he upgraded to a Yamaha DX7 synthesizer keyboard. During this writing process, Larson met Steve Skinner, who made the custom synth patches he would use. Steve would later become the person behind the orchestration arrangement for Rent. Every demo recorded by Jonathan would be in a rented studio space wherever and whenever possible. A few of his friends who, like him, were trying to make it on Broadway at the time would record vocals for these demos. Some of these friends included the late Marin Mazzie and Roger Bart. Eventually, Superbia had its first workshop around November to December 1985 at the American Society of Composers, Authors, and Publishers Workshop. This was a huge moment for Larson, as this gave him a chance to show and express his ideas amongst the writers who were successful in the game. This workshop was also a huge moment for him as he finally met his hero Stephen Sondheim in person. Sondheim, along with some other writers, expressed interest in Larson's idea when it came to the musical, while some criticized the direction he was going in. He presented more material at the Dramatists Guild in April 1986. Sondheim was there and praised the work he had to offer, but did give him notes regarding the score direction being too traditional considering what he was actually trying to do. But just like the ASCAP workshop, someone was going to criticize him, and that critic was Peter Stone, the book writer of the musical 1776 and the president of the Dramatists Guild. He criticized Larson for both the musical and the political messaging within it, where at one point, the tension became so intense that Stone began shouting over both Larson and an audience member trying to defend him. Despite receiving heavy criticism from Stone, Larson kept in touch with Sondheim through letters, and this started Stephen's mentorship over Jonathan Larson. Stephen became his mentor as he was once in the same shoes as Larson at a young age, with Oscar Hammerstein II being his mentor. He decided to repay the favor through Larson that Oscar gave to him. Larson decided to put on readings of the full musical, both public and private. Sondheim helped him receive the Richard Rodgers Development Grant, which funded the December 1988 reading of the musical, which Ira Weitzman, a producer who previously worked with Sondheim on Sunday in the Park with George, was producing. However, this reading didn't turn out the way Larson wanted it, as he wasn't able to assemble a full band, nor any of the actors that were able to sing the pop rock score he wrote, as all the actors had to be unionized. This reading was such a disappointment for him, to the point where Sondheim, who showed up to see the reading, left after the first act. However, not all hope was lost, as Victoria helped him assemble a show at the Village Gate with a live band being featured this time. And optimism started to show more as Larson received a call where he had the opportunity to develop and potentially stage the show in the UK. However, the contract he was offered would limit his ability for the show to be pitched in New York, and despite the offer being the only optimistic option, he had to decline. But his decline led to something in 1989, where he began collaborating with playwright Billy Aronson on a project known as Rent, a show meant to be a modernized version of the Puccini opera La Boheme. Together, the two composed the songs Santa Fe, Rent, and I Should Tell You. Despite his interest in collaborating with Billy, he still wanted to pursue his project with Superbia and decided to put a hold on the project. Larson was frustrated at this point with where his musical composition career was going and decided to take his feelings into his music. This resulted in what Jonathan referred to as a rock monologue known as Tick Tick Boom. Now, originally this musical was known first as Boho Days, and it premiered in September 1990 at the Second Stage Theater. The name Tick Tick Boom came into play by 1991, and in November of that same year, it was staged at the Village Gate. This production is also the same production where footage of the original format is shown on YouTube, and also rare footage of Jonathan Larson performing on stage comes from. This performance was shot by Victoria along with many of his performances. You'd think Larson stopped Superbia at this point. Actually, you're half right and wrong, because he staged another Superbia reading in December 1991. This was the final Superbia reading that Larson did, because despite his many attempts and the feedback he has received from those who have been in the game longer, the material wasn't ready for a full-on stage production. However, in recent years, with the success of the Tick Tick Boom movie musical biopic, there have been questions of Superbia being potentially revived in any way. Despite such anticipation, Lin-Manuel Miranda, the man behind Hamilton and In the Heights, both musicals, and a writer influenced by Larson himself, who directed the film, stated on Twitter that there's so many revisions of Superbia, it's a challenge. Basically, he's saying that the story remains incomplete to the multiple drafts that exist and its complex story and staging. The material of the musical that could have been still exists to this day, which can be seen either through YouTube or the Library of Congress, which is where all the unpublished material and the rest of Victoria's recordings of the shows to stage currently reside, along with Larson's original demos. As a result of Superbia not getting a production and wanting to pursue something else, Larson decided to head back to a familiar project, one that was just getting started. This was now the official start of the journey that would lead to Rent.